welcome to the latest episode of the Pop Occulture Show. I'm your host, Jason Winslade. I'm joined by my illustrious co-host, Lilith Dorsey, and we are here to talk about lots of fun stuff today. We are firmly in the new year. Happy New Year. It's 2024. We are in
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. We are in carnival season, as you can see by my festive beads.
That's how you can tell he's not in New Orleans because
Because, I only have so many beads to go around. But things are heating up down New Orleans way. And speaking of things heating up, our discussion today is on it's food. It's Mardi Gras season. I want some jambalaya and king cake. I'm hungry. But we're going to talk about something called High on the Hog. Tell us about what that is, Lilith.
Yes, I mean, some people might have been familiar with the first season of High on the Hog on Netflix. They just came out with a second season. And I'm so excited. I'm a big fan of Dr. Jessica B. Harris's work. Tiny known fact, she actually graduated from the Performance Studies department at NYU. And anybody who has gone to performance studies or cinema studies at NYU, which is one of my degrees from there, knows that it's one floor of NYU and performance studies is on one side, or when I was there anyway, and cinema studies is on the other. So it's kind of like there's this in-house fraternity. So going there and hearing about her anthropological work and hearing about all her studies with food, I was a huge fan of her work for decades, even before this show came out. So when we were thinking about exactly what we should do, it just sort of made sense to me. It is carnival season here, so food is on everybody's mind. Black people are on everybody's mind, and I just think it's a wonderful show. It's a wonderful topic, and it's a way for people to understand things. So yeah, give us a little context about the show.
Well, yeah, I mean, I want to echo that I absolutely loved this show. I wasn't aware of it until you turned me on to it, and you were like, "Oh, you just watch maybe one or two episodes," and I just binged the whole thing, from beginning to end. And yeah, it's just really fantastic. And because I am a performance studies graduate as well, and I worked with a lot of NYU people, I didn't know uh, Dr. Harris at the time, but I know plenty of people who I'm sure crossed her path. And yeah, and the show just sort of hit all of those sweet spots for me as a performance studies scholar, but also as a lover of this kind of food. And really, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about Black history. I learned a lot about the history of foods. And when we promote this, one of the things I was going to say was that, you know, pretty much anybody can name something that's talked about in this show that they've eaten. Everybody's had mac and cheese. Everybody's had French fries. Everybody's had, some form
Rice.
rice, right? Yeah. So there was just a lot going on in this show to talk about. And we're gonna take a look at some of the pop culture angles of it, but there's so much to talk about that really doesn't directly connect to pop culture, but I think we can find ways to weave it in there. Um, but yeah, so the show itself, is, as you said, based on Jessica B. Harris's 2011 book, High on the Hog: A Culinary Journey from Africa to America. And the show is called High on the Hog: How African American Cuisine Transformed America. So there is that difference. And so yeah, the first season came out in 2021. The second season came out just this past November. And there's only 4 episodes each, and they really work as a unit. Like those 8 episodes, even though there was a 2-year gap in between them, really work as sort of a full circle narrative, because it starts in Africa and goes through the slave trade and into the Great Migration, civil rights, the Black Panther movement, all of that in those 8 episodes. And so the host for the show is Steven Satterfield, who was a former chef and sommelier, and he's just I love this man. Just watching this show, it's like every episode, it's like you just want to like sit down at a table with him or give him a big hug or whatever. Like he's just so warm and gracious and so damn smart and savvy in how he frames what's happening in front of him, even if it's just a food on a plate. Just the way that he talks about all this. Um, and one of the things too I wanted to point out is it was a phrase that I hadn't heard before, that I find fascinating just as a cultural scholar, is this term foodways. Because
Where
they
you
talk about.
been?
I know. It just wasn't something that came up, and I mean, I didn't. It may have been something that I ran across in grad school, but I forgot about it. But the Wikipedia definition is the cultural, social, and economic practices relating to the production and consumption of food, and it often refers to the intersection of food and culture, traditions, and history. It's just, of course, I knew that this concept existed, but I didn't know there was a specific name for it, and so that sort of permeates this entire show. The ways that the ways that food represents all of these intersections. So let's get into it. We start
Yeah.
off, yeah, we one of the after the intro, the first thing we see is drumming, or here is drumming and dancing and singing in the phone language, um, of Benin in Africa, and that's where this first episode is mostly based. So yeah, what did you think about the way that the show frames? Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting when we look at our history of so much, obviously because of the trade of enslaved people from Africa, we've got the Fon people, we've got Dahomey, we've got these kinds of real, in a way, a sort of dark origin story where a lot of the history of people that are now Black people living in America, like myself, this is what our ancestors went through. So it makes sense that this is where they start the show. I do have to say this, although when you're watching it'll be later, but when we're filming it, it's Voodoo Day in Benin. So to bring it back to that kind of occult context, and we'll get into this more later, but Benin is really first and foremost the culture that gave us voodoo, and it picked up a lot of things along the way through Haiti and through indigenous people here in New Orleans. But when we look at the history of voodoo, Benin is definitely one of those places that we go back to. So it makes sense that this is also the place where they start their journey with the food. This is really important to me and close to my heart because it's something that we're talking about, not just the food, but the religion making this transatlantic journey, this religion being added to and favored by all the things that touched along the way. So I think it's beautiful that they start with spirit, even though we don't necessarily have it pointed to or explained until we get further into the series. They're into both the first episode and the late episodes about how this actually fits in to the food, but it's something that I think is iconic and part of Black America in that way. So of course and very, right? Like very colorful, very visual, very enthralled almost, right? Like it draws you in, the sound of the drums, the beauty of the movement of these dancers doing these ritual dances, these sacred dances that they've done for hundreds and hundreds of years.
yeah, I mean, just as a documentary series, it's just gorgeous. It's just so well filmed and edited, and the way they use the sound design is just, yeah, it really does entrance you. Yeah, and they talk about, uh one of the things about the show is that it seems like almost every episode, they talk to there's a lot of food bloggers and chefs and authors and lots of James Beard award winning everything. um
Of course.
yeah, and at the sometimes in the middle, but also at the end, there are gatherings of the different people he's talked to in that episode, and those communal tables really are, the space for incredibly fruitful discussion on the history of food and culture. And so in that first episode, one of the things that was very striking was they have this meal that they say this is before the slave ship. This is what would have been eaten here before the slave trade started. Um, and so I think in that context, they've talked about that, because they go to some of those villages. Ganvier, I believe, is one of these sort of waterway
Yes, Gambier.
villages. And again, like making me think of New Orleans and places on the water and that connection to voodoo there. And there's a voodoo legend about how that community started. Um, but they don't necessarily talk about voodoo as a foundational for the food, but they talk about it as foundational for the stories and the culture, and just the way that, I mean, just in that episode, he's just on a boat and he tries various foods that they're selling from the boats, and his guide points out, oh, there's this church and that church and this church, and there's a Christian church, there's a mosque, and then there's the voodoo church, and that's the first one. And the high priestess they interview says that we worship voodoo. We have many religions, but voodoo is the first. We worship the voodoo. We worship voodoo with a single faith. We tell people from abroad we are voodoo followers, so there's a clear identification with voodoo, within that town, with that community. But it is sort of like added as kind of like a flavor there. It doesn't quite go into the depth that it could in terms of the influence on the food. But I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there were, for me, there's two things I want to talk about here. The first is that legend with the crocodile. They talk about how, the crocodile saved all these people that were fleeing, being captured and brought into slavery and things like that. And really how the Gambier owes its survival and its existence to voodoo. So I think that's fascinating. But again, it's still downplayed a little bit to me. And the thing that I found disappointing about it is there's a very similar tale that Zora Neale Hurston writes about, coming from the swamps in Florida and South Carolina, where, we've got this character, Uncle Monday, which is sort of this voodoo person that transforms into a crocodile that helps to save freeing slaves and things of that nature. So that to me is just an obvious click that we didn't get in the show, because I think that's fascinating that we have a story that is very, very similar. We've got the crocodile over here, we've got the alligators here, so we've got this parallel that's drawn in the folk tales and the sacred stories. But I do think there's a way in which it's downplayed, as a voodoo priestess, in addition to being a scholar. I think there's a way in which they downplay it. There's a way in which I feel like, not to trash the show, but in order to make it palatable for Netflix, we've got to, even in the opening shots of the voodoo scene in that first episode, people are wearing a gold cross. We were talking earlier, you were talking about, well, this could be syncretism, and it is syncretism, but the fact that the cameraman and the editor decide to focus in on this cross in a sea of voodoo ritual is fascinating to me, and just a tiny bit disappointing, because I'm sure there were African symbols that they could have focused on in that moment that would have been equally fascinating to us, and have certainly been underrepresented. So in that way, it was a little disappointing to me, because there were so many times where I thought they could bring up the connection, with voodoo, even in, we'll probably talk more about this later, but the first episode of the second season, when they're talking about New Orleans, we don't have these connections to voodoo, which are obviously here. And I'm not one of these people that, because I practice, I see the connections everywhere. It's simple things like Marie Laveau. It's simple things like, people are still making voodoo cocktails for Marie Laveau that are served in the hotels and stuff. There's this sort of crossover with the spirituality and the food, and that being so important to ritual, that I was disappointed. I guess I'm just going to say disappointed 500 times.
Yeah, I did read something somewhere that Dr. Harris was saying if there was a third season, she would like to go back and do more in-depth stuff about New Orleans and Chicago, because it really was the way that episode was, and I believe it was, the first episode of the second season, where they talk about that the Great Migration. So it really is about the travel from one to the other, but not so much about what's happening in the cultures. Although there's one episode that talks about the Senegal connection with New Orleans, and how the New Orleans food is represented. I mean, even that first episode where they're like, oh yeah, this name for okra sounds like gumbo, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that you know, these are all the things that they find there that represent what became what became, you know, classic soul food. Um, but yeah, there's definitely you know, obviously a more of an emphasis on the Christian stuff. There's a later episode where he's in a praise house, and you know, there's a lot of comments about African American spirituality and sort of broader discussions about what that means. Again, as that sort of like overarching, almost syncretic viewpoint, and not really specifically about particular practices. Although I did find interesting the episode where they went into a mosque and they talked about the very specific, you know, in within that, staying within that community, that recipe for pecan pie, um, and how you can only get it if you can only, you know, take part in this if you are somehow part of this community or whatever. So there's that sense of what's ours, the insularity and all that. But yeah, there's not a lot of deep connection like that with the voodoo aspect.
I'm laughing because I had a friend when I was in grad school that did a piece based off of Bell Hook's Desire and Eating the Other, and she called it Desire and Reheating the Other. And it was all about how you
Right.
can get these sort of packaged foods from different cultures and reheat that and have this kind of, you know, exotic experience through the food. And I think that, yeah, it was very entertaining. But
Yeah, I
again, with
mean,
these
reheating is a performance practice. That's a, you know,
uh-huh, yeah, reheating the other. So
there you go.
that way, but I do think it's interesting, you know, all of these foodways that we're talking to, not just through the foodways that traveled with the migration. And it was really moving to me to see the Pullman porters and that older gentleman who was a Pullman porter, you know, black don't crack, man. That guy looked fantastic for 99. May he rise in power. He's no longer with us, but
Right, like
just
just after the filming.
but I think and it was really also moving to me to have them speak to the grandson of Arturo Schomburg, you know, where because so much of Black culture and Black history is housed in the Schomburg collection in the special library, which is part of the New York City Public Libraries at the Schomburg. My work is in the Schomburg. So just the fact that in a way, they're honoring people who did do all this fantastic archival work 80, 100 years ago, but then they're also doing their own archival work by taking these stories from these people and recording that. You know, I'm an anthropologist. I'm all about these first person narratives. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Hearing about the things that people cooked and the things that people grew. You know, that was so fascinating to me, this sort of whole food justice movement, which has been
Right.
getting more popularity the past, you know, I guess really 10, 15 years within the Black community. And I think that that reclaiming is very important. And I'm so happy that they touched on that.
Yeah, I think Setterfield in an interview had said that the first season was more about finding those stories that had been lost or under you know, focused on, and then the second season was about living memory, was about people who actually were there, and or their families were there, talking about the civil rights movement and things like that. Um, so yeah, there's a lot going on in each episode, and you say like, it's very moving. I mean, I you know, who knew I'd be like bawling my eyes out at a cooking show? Like every episode, there's always something where I'm like, dude, man, that's intense, that's heavy, that's you know, you feel a lot of it, especially because Setterfield is such a great host and conduit for these stories and the audience. So yeah, I mean, it's just an incredibly moving show.
I mean, Dr. Harris or Dr. J's words are so moving as well. You know, when
Yeah,
she said things like, why New Orleans? Because my soul sings here. You know,
right.
it's just so poetic. It's almost, I can tell she's performance studies because it's visceral. Like
Oh yeah,
it makes me move from every cell in my body just watching her in this two dimensions, you know. So I can almost smell the food when they're eating it. I can
right.
almost, you know, dance those moves while I'm sitting here. So it really is fascinating to me that they could accomplish all of that through, you know, such a flat medium, literally.
Yeah, I mean, you know, her Yeah, I read reviews that they referred to her as like a Maya Angelou type because she has that, you know, has that voice and that method of delivery. And yeah, there was something. Oh gosh, there are so many great quotes. I took a lot of notes. There's so many great quotes from her, especially. Um, and I think this goes into what will, you know, sort of expand on the occult aspect, just in terms of what food means as not only a cultural touchstone, but as, for lack of a better term, a magical one, an alchemical one. And so, you know, that history is distilled into this, you know, when they talk about like these stories meeting on a plate, and it's the way that they frame that. I just think it's so fascinating. So there's a couple of quotes I want to throw out there and see what, you know, your responses to them. So yeah, so I think it's episode 2 in the first season. Culinary historian Michael Twitty says, "When you eat the cooking I pulled together from our history, I want you to understand you are in the presence of your ancestors, and our job is to pass those traditions on so they, like the soul, never die." Oof, that's such a
Oh, that's beautiful.
yeah,
That's
that's such
so
an
beautiful.
intense, you know, so
Yeah.
well crafted statement from this historian who was, again, you know, great story. And he's telling this as he's making a traditional stew on a traditional, you know, with traditional cooking influence over the fire, you know, which of course, you know, when we talk about, I just had this thing the other day where we had students talking about their humanities, you know, what their connection to humanities is, and one guy was like, I never thought that cooking would be part of the humanities. I'm like, well, you know, it's one of the first art forms, right? You know, because he's talking about music as well. It's like, yeah, music and cooking is the first art form. The way we, you know, we go from that mode of survival to cuisine, and that's a lot what the show is about too.
Mhm.
Is that mode of survival during the slave trade and developing that into cuisine. So yeah, I mean that was one of those really powerful quotes.
Yeah, it is because it's just so important. And I love that you use the word alchemical, you know what I mean? Because it is transformative. You know, so many times in the show, they're talking about enslaved people having very little left. You know what I mean? We had to use the pig foot, we had to use cornmeal. All we had were these really basic things that, you know, were left behind because nobody really wanted them, you know. But then they could elevate that scene again with the Schomburg grandson and the Madam C.J. Walker great granddaughter, where they're talking about, oh yeah, we used to have oysters and lobster all the time, and then it got all, you know, fancy gentrified, and now it went from $5 a plate to $30 a plate, and you know, it's probably even more in some places here in this city. So you know, this kind of thing where it was part of Black culture and then it got taken by other people, you know, and in so many ways it was what we were using to honor our ancestors, to honor that memory. You know, that we couldn't necessarily have our religious items, but we were relegated to the kitchen because somebody had to do the cooking, and you had to, it was an all day job, right? Like you had to stoke the fire, you had to flip the chicken, you had to do all these things that did require extensive time and labor. And it was really powerful for me too when they talked about, like, when you were on the auction block, that the you know, the salespeople would say, oh, this one's a good cook, you know, like, so these skills in some way got you more, you know, money on the auction block for you, and then gave you slightly different duties or status or whatever. So that knowledge was prized, and it was one of the few bits of knowledge that was allowed to survive because it tasted good and everybody wanted to eat something that tasted, to have these things, or allowed to have these things more than some of, I would say, the traditional elements of spirituality.
Right. It was a magical ceremony that they
And
actually do.
yeah.
And you know, and then there's later episodes where they talk about how just that talent and skill for the culinary is also what, you know, grew their wealth and identity in, you know, you know, in America. So there's just so much that food is that pathway towards, you know, through with identity.
I also think it's interesting, you know, you talk about him being a sommelier, you know, and he mentions, I think pretty early on, that he had to sort of leave that profession because he still wasn't granted the respect. It was still on some level a way of serving. And I think that that's
Right.
interesting. You know, my daughter works in the restaurant industry. She has her SOMS license, but right now she's working as consulting, which I think is hilarious to me, because that's, again, Virgo telling people things as opposed to taking orders from others all the time. So I think it's still interesting that that is a challenge. You know, that is a challenge for Black younger people now today, even after hundreds of years of gaining this knowledge, honing this knowledge, becoming experts in this knowledge. And it still in many ways is a struggle.
Yeah. Yeah. There are a lot of really, again, there's really moving scenes in this, especially when they're talking about, obviously there's the long history, but then also even within what's happening in that episode, you know, families being displaced from their homes because of eminent domain, or Jarell Guy, author of Black Girl Baking, talks about the kitchen being her safe space, and because Black women don't feel safe in other spaces. And there was another one about the group that was doing the supper club, the sort of the queer, the LGBTQ group in, I think it's the last episode, where they talk about, they even use the word conjuring family for ourselves. And so there's again, there's that metaphor of magic there, where they're centering love and healing in this, but they want to reimagine what the dinner table is, that this with this community. So there's a lot of talk about dinner tables and what they represent. And there's another great quote from Dr. Harris. We are a spiritual people. We understand the need for ceremony. Ceremony is the punctuation that rhythms and rhymes and defines our lives and on the table. I'm sort of paraphrasing here. And that she talks about the Great Migration and the ceremonies when leaving and making a transition. That there are always these ceremonies that, where food is the main, item of transformation, right? That represents that and also sends you on your way.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote that quote down too, ironically. You know what I mean? Because I love that moment. And I love that moment where they're eating in modern day and they get their little desserts in a tiny little go box. You know what I mean? And they talk about how this sort of communal eating was denied them for so long. So this was a nod to the past, a nod to remembering, right? What is remembered lives. If we can remember these ancestors and eat their foods, and that, I mean, for me, that's a huge part of voodoo. Sometimes I have to explain to my students, my godchildren, why are we paying so much attention to the food? It's because wherever somebody is at, they can still eat the food and enjoy the food and receive that blessing and that magic from the food. So it doesn't matter if somebody is special needs. It doesn't matter if somebody's 2 years old. It doesn't matter if somebody's 100 years old. It doesn't matter if somebody speaks another language. They can still internalize that magic and gain sustenance from it. And that to me is why I think that the food is always so important when this is happening, that it really is a huge part of things. And you can't separate it under any circumstances.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's just so much going on in, in the food and the eating of the food, presenting the food. And they say that, like, you always got to eat. So,
Right.
we want to thank you for watching and liking and sharing and subscribing. And we really appreciate your support. And once again, as we always do, we want you to check out our Patreon site at www.patreon.com/popoccultureshow, where you'll get lots of fun.
Thank you to all our subscribers. Yay.
Yes, we like subscribers. Next time, we are going to attempt to address the holy grail of occult films, Holy Mountain. I've never seen it. I know people are shocked.
What?
Seen it. You're shocked that I haven't seen it. I'm going to be watching it with eyes wide open. And
you're gonna have to watch it 4 or 5 times, man. There's a lot going on in there.
Oh, I'm sure.
Jodorowsky is El Maestro. Like, there is a reason people call him that. He is fascinating. I mean, come on, how many film directors also have their own tarot deck, their own tarot book? I have it over here, Hodorowski, how he explained tarot to his cat. Um, he's amazing. He's just amazing.
So yes,
So you're in for a treat.
this is the grand, you know, end all be all of occult films that we're gonna try to. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it'll even be a two-parter. Who knows? We'll see how it goes, or maybe there'll just be lots of fun extras that you can check out on the Patreon site. But until next
Maybe we'll
time,
dress like frogs and lizards, and you'll
well,
figure out what that means when you see the movie.
yes. And those of you who haven't seen the movie, I guess you'll be in for a treat as well. So again, from me, Jason Winslade, and from Lilith
Lilith Dorsey.
Dorsey, uh, by the time you've seen this, Voodoo Day will be over. But for people like us, Voodoo Day is every day. And
Yes.
and we'll see you next time on the Pop Culture Show. Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.